Welcome to Late Night Calm. Tonight, let the room go soft around you. Let your shoulders settle into whatever is holding them. There is nothing you need to carry into this story, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to do but lie still and let an old, strange world unfold itself slowly in the dark. We are going to travel a very long way tonight, and we are going to travel it slowly, the way you would walk through a sleeping house by candlelight, not rushing, not reaching for the switch, just letting the small circle of warm light move gently from room to room. Picture, if you can, a small town in France, more than 200 years ago. It is morning. The light is thin and grey, the kind of early light that has not yet decided whether the day will be warm. There is a square at the centre of the town, cobbled, worn smooth by generations of feet, and at the edge of the square there is a building, the town hall, the mairie, with its shuttered windows and its heavy door. And on this particular morning, the door is open, and there is a crowd, not a festival crowd, not a market crowd, a quiet one. Families standing close together, mothers with their hands pressed to their mouths, fathers looking at the ground, and among them, the young men. They are all roughly the same age, 20 years old, give or take. Some of them have never been further than the next village. Some of them have wives already, or sweethearts, or fields they expected to plough until they were old. And every one of them has come here because the law has called them, and the law in this country has a long arm and a longer memory, and there is no pretending you did not hear it. Inside the mairie, on a plain table, there is an urn. Just a vessel, really. A jar, a bowl, a wooden box with a hole in the lid, depending on the town and the year. Inside it are folded papers, numbered, and one by one, the young men of the town are going to step forward, reach in, and draw. This is the tirage au sort, the drawing of lots, and it is the single most frightening morning many of these young men will ever know, more frightening in a way than any battle that may come after, because a battle, at least, you can fight. This you cannot fight. This is a number in a jar, and your whole life is folded inside it. Let me tell you how this came to be, gently, so you understand the machine these boys were standing inside. In the year 1798, a law was passed in France. It is called the Jourdan-Delbrel law, named for the two men who put it forward, and it did something that had never quite been done at this scale before. It made military service universal for the young men of the nation. Every unmarried man between the ages of 20 and 25 was now, by law, liable to be called to serve. Not just the poor, not just the volunteers, not just the desperate. All of them. The law did not care whether you were a farmer or a clerk or the son of a man with a little money. It cared only that you were young and male and unmarried, and that the nation had need of you. This law was the great engine. Napoleon did not invent it. He inherited it, and then he used it the way a man uses a tool he has decided he will never put down. Between the years 1800 and 1813, this machine pulled roughly 2.5 million men out of the towns and villages of France and fed them into the armies. 2.5 million. Think of that number slowly, the way you might count something in the dark to make yourself drowsy. 2.5 million young men, each one with a mother somewhere, each one with a morning in a town square and a hand reaching into an urn. And here is the part that makes this story worth telling, the promise we will hold open tonight like a lamp we keep lit all the way through. There was a saying in this army. It was said that every French soldier carried, tucked away in his knapsack, a marshal's baton. The baton was the symbol of the very highest rank a soldier could reach, the rank of marshal, a thing so exalted it was almost royalty. And the saying meant something quite radical for its time. It meant that any one of these frightened boys in the town square, any one of them, the poorest and the lowest, might one day rise to command armies, to wear gold, to be made rich beyond his grandfather's wildest imagining. The ladder went all the way to the top, and in theory, every man's foot was already on the bottom rung. We are going to climb that ladder tonight, slowly, rung by rung. We are going to ask, at every level, two very simple, very human questions. What did they pay you, and how were you likely to die? Because both of those answers were true at once, and you cannot understand the one without the other. This was, at the same time, the most extraordinary machine for lifting a nobody to the heights that the world had ever seen, and one of the most efficient machines for grinding ordinary men into the ground that the world had ever seen. The dream and the horror lived in the same uniform, but before we climb, lie still a moment with me in the town square, because there is a great deal of life down here at the very bottom, before any man has marched anywhere at all. And I would love to know, as we begin this slow journey, where in the world you are listening from tonight. If you feel like leaving a word in the comments, a place, a country, a city, I read them. And there is something I find quietly comforting about knowing this calm little room reaches so many far-off places in the dark. And if you are new here, and you would like more of these slow, unhurried journeys into the past to help you find your way to sleep, you are welcome to subscribe. Then let the room go quiet again, and come back with me to the urn. So, the young man reaches in. His hand is trembling, and there is no shame in that, because everyone in the square knows exactly what is at stake. He draws a folded paper. He opens it, and on it is a number. A low number meant the army. A low number meant you marched. A high number meant you stayed, you went home, you kept your fields and your sweetheart and your ordinary life. So the whole future of a young man came down to whether the slip of paper in his shaking fingers carried a small number or a large one. You can picture the two faces in the crowd, the boy who draws high and the relief that breaks over him like water, the way his mother sags against his father, the quiet, almost guilty joy of it. And beside him, the boy who draws low, who stands very still, who does not say anything at all, who feels the square go strange and far away because he has just learned how the rest of his life is going to begin. This was a real ritual. It happened in real town squares with real urns, year after year, class after class, each year's crop of 20-year-olds called a class by the birth year that bound them together. The drama of the draw, the urn, the trembling hand, the cheer or the silence, this was woven into the life of every French village for a generation. Mothers dreaded it from the moment a son was born. They counted the years toward it the way you might count toward a storm you can see coming across a flat plain, slowly, helplessly. Now, here is the first soft turn in our story, the first quiet way out. And it is a way out that only some could take. If you drew a bad number, if you drew low and the army opened its mouth for you, there was still by law one door left. You could send someone else in your place. You could hire a man to go and serve for you, a substitute, what the French called a remplaçant, a replacer. It was entirely legal. If you could find a man willing to take your number and your fate, and if you could pay him, then he marched and you stayed. The law permitted it openly. The state did not much care which body filled the boots, only that the boots were filled. But of course, a thing like that is never free. A man does not cheerfully trade away years of his life, and possibly his life itself, for nothing. So the price of a substitute rose and fell with the danger of the times, and in the dangerous late years of the empire, when everyone knew that the wars had grown vast and hungry, and that fewer and fewer men were coming home, the price climbed and climbed. By the later years, hiring a replacement could cost you somewhere between 1,800 and 4,000 francs, sometimes more when the conscriptions grew especially terrible and the chance of return especially thin. Hold that number against the world it lived in. 4,000 francs was an enormous sum to an ordinary family. It was a small fortune. It was the kind of money a working man might never see all at once in his entire life. And so the door of the remplaçant, this legal escape hatch, was really only a door for the families who had money. The middle-class family, the family with a little land or a little trade behind it, could buy their son out of the war. The poor family could not. The poor son marched, and the comfortable son stayed home, and everyone understood this perfectly well, and it was simply how the machine worked. Risk flowed downhill toward those least able to refuse it, the way it so often does. And because this was such a real and present danger to families with something to lose, something rather remarkable grew up around it, a whole little industry. There appeared societies, almost like insurance companies, that a family could pay into before the draw, betting against a bad number. These were called the assurances contre le tirage, insurance against the draw. The idea was simple and very modern. A family would pay a sum in advance year by year, and if the worst happened, if the son drew a low number and was called, the society would provide the money for a substitute or arrange one. It was a way to spread the terror, to soften the lottery with arithmetic, to turn the trembling hand at the urn into a managed risk, the way we might insure a house against fire. Families of means slept a little easier, knowing they had paid against the urn. Families without means simply lay awake. So that was the legal door, the door of money, but not every young man had money. And not every young man who lacked money was willing to simply walk into the boots that fate had drawn for him. And here, our story darkens a little in the way the old stories do, just enough to make the warmth of the room feel a little safer by comparison. There were other ways out, illegal ways, desperate ways, and men took them, in real life, with their own hands, because they were that afraid of the number in the urn. Some men ran, they fled, they disappeared into the forests and the hills and the back country, refusing to answer the call, becoming what the French named réfractaires, the refusers, the draft dodgers. They lived rough, hidden, hunted, cut off from their families and their fields, because that was better to them than marching. And the state, of course, did not simply shrug and let them go. The state sent mobile columns after them, flying squads of soldiers whose whole purpose was to hunt down the men who would not come. And when the hunters could not find the son, they punished the family instead. They would billet soldiers in the houses of the réfractaires, quartering troops on the family, forcing them to feed and house the very men who had come to drag their boy away, an expensive, humiliating, grinding punishment designed to make the family give the runaway up. So the choice to flee was never a clean escape. It fell, like everything else, on the people left behind. And then there were the men who did something harder to even speak of, something done quietly, in a barn or a back room, with a clenched jaw. Men who damaged their own bodies on purpose so that the army would not want them. You see, a soldier in this age needed certain things to do his work, and the simplest of those things were his own hands and his own teeth. To load his musket, a soldier had to bite open a paper cartridge. The cartridge was a little twist of paper holding the gunpowder and the ball, and the soldier would tear it open with his front teeth, pour the powder, ram the ball, and fire. It was a motion he would repeat 1,000 times. And so a man who knocked out his own front teeth, who took a stone or a hammer and did that terrible thing to himself, made himself useless to the army in one of its most basic functions. He could no longer bite the cartridge, he could no longer be a line infantryman, and some men did exactly this. They broke their own teeth rather than march. Others went after the trigger finger. The right index finger, the finger that pulls the trigger, the finger without which a man cannot fire a musket. There were men who cut it off, who maimed their own hand, who paid in flesh and pain and a lifetime of disability rather than answer the number. Others feigned illness, faked a limp, faked a fit, swallowed things to make themselves sick, did whatever they could to fail the examination. The lengths to which a frightened young man would go tell you more plainly than any number exactly how frightened he was. These were not cowards in any simple sense. These were ordinary people doing arithmetic of the most desperate kind, deciding that a broken body at home was a better life than a whole body marching toward Russia. Let that settle for a moment. Let it remind you, lying here in your warm and quiet room, how gently your own night is treating you. No urn, no number, no hammer in the barn. Just the soft dark and a voice telling you an old story, and all the time in the world to fall asleep inside it. Now let us return to the young man who did not run, who did not maim himself, who could not afford a substitute, who simply drew his low number, closed his fist around his fate, and went. The vast majority did exactly this. They went. And we are going to follow one of them in our minds, down into the life he was about to enter, the life at the very bottom of the great ladder. The first thing he would have learned, and learned quickly, was what the army was actually going to pay him for all this. And the answer, the plain and almost laughable answer, was very nearly nothing. The pay of a conscript at the bottom was nominal. It existed mostly on paper. A French infantry private's base pay was famously almost comically low, on the order of a few centimes, a few sous, per day, and even that small sum was whittled down by deductions before it ever reached his hand. It was a fraction of what the same young man might have earned as a civilian labourer, swinging a scythe or hauling stone back in his own village. A working man at home could make more in a day than a soldier of the emperor made for risking his life. There was no fortune in the pay packet. There was barely a coin in it. The soldiers knew this perfectly well, and they joked about it, the way men in hard situations have always joked. They said they fought for la gloire, for glory, because it certainly was not for the wages. It was a bitter, knowing little joke. Glory does not fill a belly. Glory does not buy a pair of shoes. But the army handed out glory by the cartload, in the form of fine words and waving flags and the emperor's praise, precisely because it could not hand out money. Glory was cheap to manufacture, and the treasury was not bottomless, and so the men were paid in honor, which costs the state almost nothing and starved a little for cash. So if the pay was a joke, how did a soldier live? Where did his real subsistence come from? It came from two places. First, from his rations, the food the army was supposed to provide, which we will come to in good time, the bread and the meat and the wine that arrived gloriously and reliably on paper, and rather less gloriously and less reliably in the mud. And second, increasingly, dangerously, it came from the land itself, from the country the army marched through, from what a soldier could take. We will come to that too, to the looted watch and the chickens and the wine and the silver, to the way that plunder quietly became the soldier's real, unofficial wage when the official one was a few sad sous. But that is a story for a little further up the road, when our young man has his musket on his shoulder and the dust of the march in his throat. For now, simply hold the shape of the thing in your mind, the way you would hold a smooth stone in your palm until it grows warm. A young man, 20 years old, in a grey town square. A trembling hand in an urn, a number, a whole future folded inside it. A door of money for the families who had it, and no door at all for the families who did not. The runner in the forest, the broken teeth, the cut finger, the soldiers billeted on a weeping mother's house, And then, for the great mass of them, the ones who simply went, a uniform that paid in glory because it could not pay in coin, and a long, long road stretching out ahead toward a horizon that might end in a marshal's baton, or might end in a field hospital, or might end, as so many of them ended, in the snow. He has his number now. He has said his goodbyes however he could. He is no longer a boy in a square. He is a soldier of the emperor, the lowest of all the ranks, a private in the line, and he is about to learn exactly what that body of his is worth, and exactly how much weight it can be made to carry before it breaks. The bread he will be promised, and the bread he will actually receive. The musket they will put in his hands, and the load they will pile on his back. The strange, brutal economy of a man whose official wage is nothing and whose survival depends on what he can find. So let us go with him slowly out of the town square and onto the road, into the life of the private soldier, where the first hard lesson of the whole ladder is waiting, the lesson written into the aching muscles of his own shoulders before he has ever seen an enemy at all.
But before we follow him fully onto that road, let us stay a moment longer with the urn, because the urn is where everything begins, and it is worth understanding just how vast and how cold the machine behind it really was. There was a law. It had a name, the way these things always have a name when a state means to make them permanent. The Jourdan-Delbrel law passed in the autumn of 1798, years before the man called Napoleon had made himself an emperor at all.
He did not invent it. He inherited it the way a man inherits a house, and then he lived in it more fully than anyone who came before him. The law said something simple and enormous. Every unmarried man in France between the ages of 20 and 25 belonged in some sense to the army. Not all of them at once, but all of them in principle, all of them liable, all of them waiting for their birth year to be called, their class, the cohort of men born in the same 12 months, summoned together to the town hall to draw their fate from the same urn. And from that single law, across the years that followed, between the turn of the century and the long unravelling that came after, France drew somewhere near 2.5 million men. 2.5 million numbers pulled from urns in town squares across the country. 2.5 million trembling hands. It is a figure too large to feel, so do not try to feel all of it. Feel one. Feel the one in the grey square, the one whose stone you are still holding, warm in your palm. The drawing itself was a ritual, as much as a wedding or a funeral was a ritual, and the whole village knew its shape. The young men of the class would gather. There would be the official, and the table, and the urn, and inside the urn the numbered tickets, one for each man. A low number meant you marched, a high number meant you stayed, meant you kept your fields and your trade and your sweetheart and your ordinary, unremarkable life. So the hand went into the urn not knowing which life it would pull out. And the square held its breath. And when the number came up low, there might be a silence, the particular silence of a mother understanding what she has just heard. And when it came up high, there might be a cheer, a real cheer, the joy of a man who has just been handed back his own future. The same urn, the same square, the same morning. Two completely different lives, separated by nothing but the blind luck of a folded paper. But the urn was not quite the end of it, not for everyone, and here is where the first door opened, the door that only money could unlock, because the law allowed a thing that seems almost shocking to us now, though it seemed perfectly ordinary then. If you drew a bad number, and if your family had the means, you could hire another man to go in your place. A replacement. A remplaçant, they called him. You paid, and he marched, and the army did not much care which body filled the boots, so long as a body did. The price was not small, and it climbed as the years grew darker and the danger grew plainer. In the calmer years, it might be 1,800 francs. In the worst years, when everyone understood what a campaign in the East could do to a man, it could rise to 4,000 francs, sometimes more, because by then the substitutes knew exactly what they were selling and they charged accordingly. Think for a moment what that meant. The franc of a private soldier was counted in sous, in centimes, in the smallest coins there were. And here was a sum, 4,000 francs, that an ordinary labourer could not have saved across a lifetime of work. So the door of the remplaçant was a real door, but it was a door for the comfortable, for the merchant's son, the notary's son, the prosperous farmer's son. The poor man's son had no such door. He had only the urn and his own 2 legs, and the road. And because there was money in it, an entire little industry grew up around the fear of a bad number, the way industries always grow up around fear. There were societies you could pay into year after year, a kind of insurance against the draw. Assurances contre le tirage, they were called. Insurance against the lottery. A careful family of the middling sort might pay in steadily through a boy's youth, so that if his number came up low, the society would furnish the funds or furnish the substitute outright, and the boy would never have to march. So the danger of the urn became, for those who could afford to plan for it, simply another household expense, like insuring a barn against fire. The rich did not gamble with the urn at all. The poor had nothing else. For the man who had no money and would not go, there was only one road left, and it was a hard and lonely one. He could run. He could refuse the number, vanish from the square, slip into the forests and the hills, and become what they called a réfractaire, a refuser, a draft dodger, living rough beyond the reach of the law. And some did, but the state did not simply shrug and let them go. The state hunted them. It sent out mobile columns, flying detachments of soldiers whose work was precisely this, to scour the countryside for the men who had run. And when it could not find the man himself, it punished the family that had hidden him by the simplest and most miserable means it had. It billeted soldiers on the household. It quartered armed men in the réfractaire's own home, men who had to be fed and housed and endured day after day, eating the family's bread, sitting at the family's table, a living punishment installed in the heart of the house until the runaway came in or the family was broken by the cost of keeping them. So even running was not free. Even running was paid for, in the end, by someone. And then there were the men who did not run exactly, but who could not face the road and who turned the violence inward instead. This is the part that is hard to hear in the quiet of the night, so hear it gently. There were men who maimed their own bodies to make those bodies useless to the army. Some knocked out their own front teeth.
It sounds senseless until you understand the musket of the age, until you understand that a soldier loaded his weapon by biting open the paper cartridge that held the powder, biting it open with his front teeth, every single shot, again and again, down the length of a battle. A man with no front teeth could not do it, and so a man might destroy his own smile deliberately to fail the only test that mattered.
Others went further still and cut away the index finger of the right hand, the trigger finger, the one finger the army absolutely required, reasoning that a man who could not pull a trigger could not be made to fire. To do such a thing to your own hand by your own hand tells you everything about how much these young men feared the number in the urn and how little they trusted the glory they were promised in its place. For the great mass of them, of course, did none of this. The great mass simply went. They had no 4,000 francs and no insurance society, and they could not bring themselves to run to the forest or to ruin their own bodies, and so they did the thing that most people in most ages do when the state comes for them. They obeyed. They put on the uniform, and the uniform, when they put it on, paid them almost nothing at all. This is the strange truth that sits underneath the whole towering structure of the army, the truth the listener must carry up every rung of the ladder we are about to climb. At the very bottom, the wage was very nearly nothing. A few sous a day in theory, and after the deductions, the stoppages, the small, relentless subtractions for this and that, often only a handful of the smallest coins ever reached the soldier's actual hand. Men joked about it the way men joke about the things that wound them. They said they fought for la gloire, for glory, because it was certain they were not fighting for the money. And it was a joke, but it was also exactly true. The state could not or would not pay these men a living wage. What it offered instead was the dream, the door, the long, shining possibility folded inside the same machine that had pulled them from the urn. The possibility that this body, worth so little in coin, might somehow, across years of road and powder and luck, be worth a baton. So that is the bargain our young man has accepted, whether he understands it yet or not. Almost no wages, a road without an end he can see, and a promise whispered into every knapsack in the army that the lowest of them might one day rise to the very highest. He has stepped out of the square now. The urn is behind him. The forest and the broken teeth and the borrowed substitute, all the doors he did not or could not take, are behind him. Ahead is only the road and the weight he will carry on it, and the slow education of his own shoulders. So let us talk about the weight. Before the soldier sees a battle, before he draws a franc or tastes the first of whatever this country will or will not give him to eat, he must first carry the army on his own back. Every morning, before the column moves, he lifts it up and buckles it on, and the army becomes him, or he becomes it. And the distinction after several months on the road is very nearly meaningless. The men who study these things have counted it out and weighed it, and the number is this: roughly 25 to 30 kilograms of equipment loaded onto a body that is usually young and often underfed, and required to march through whatever the season has decided to offer that day, whether mud or dust or ice or all three before afternoon. Consider what that weight consists of, because the particulars matter, and because in the particulars is the whole philosophy of what it meant to be a fusilier, a French infantry private, at the bottom of the world's most ambitious army. The musket alone accounted for more than 4.5 kilograms. It was the Charleville Model 1777, a weapon already a generation old when most of Napoleon's wars were fought, a long-barreled flintlock smoothbore that fired a lead ball of roughly 17.5 millimeters across. Think of that ball sitting in your palm, heavier than you would expect, not quite the size of a marble you might play with as a child, but close and made not of glass, but of soft grey lead, dense and final. Against a formed body of men, at perhaps 50 to 100 meters, it was a practical weapon. Against a single man past that distance, it was optimism. The flintlock mechanism that fired it, a chip of flint striking steel to make a spark to light a charge, to push that ball, failed roughly 15 to 20 times out of every 100 in wet weather, which meant that in the rain, in the fog, on a morning when the whole world was damp and grey, something close to 1 shot in 5 simply did not fire at all. The soldier pulled the trigger and heard only a click and a hiss, the spark swallowed by moisture before it could accomplish anything. He had to clear the pan and try again, or simply wait for a dry moment that might not come. A trained man, a man who had been drilled until the sequence was muscle memory rather than thought, could manage perhaps 2 to 3 rounds per minute. Load the charge from the paper cartridge, and here the front teeth matter, because to tear the paper cartridge open quickly a soldier bit it, which was why knocking out one's front teeth was a recognized if desperate way to appear unfit for service, because without them you could not efficiently load a smoothbore musket, or so the examining officers were supposed to believe, pour the powder into the barrel, seat the ball, ram it home with the iron ramrod, prime the pan, close the frizzen, cock the hammer, aim in the rough direction of the enemy, and fire 2 to 3 times in 60 seconds if the weather held and the hands were steady and the man himself was not yet dead or wounded or simply trembling too hard to manage the sequence. On a good day, with the sun out and the column moving smartly, it was almost a kind of mechanical dignity. On the other days, it was just a heavy stick and a prayer. The musket went into the haversack straps or across the shoulder, and the haversack itself, the pack, the great leather and cloth knapsack, went on his back. Inside it, a greatcoat folded as tightly as it could be folded, which was never tight enough, spare shoes, because a man who walked everywhere needed spare shoes and knew it, a mess tin for whatever would eventually be cooked in it, several days' worth of bread or biscuit, hard enough that the front teeth, if he still had them, were tested by it, cleaning materials for the musket, small personal things whatever he had managed to bring from wherever he had come from. The giberne, the cartridge pouch, hung on its own belt across his hip or chest, carrying 50 or more paper cartridges, each one a small, dense package of powder and ball and the paper tube that held them, together constituting a supply of violence that weighed its own substantial portion of the total. The bayonet on its frog, the canteen, the gaiters and straps and buttons and buckles, and the small administrative weight of being a military man in an age when an army's credibility partly depended on the tidiness of its buckles, and he walked. That was the great fact of a fusilier's life, a fact so obvious it is easy to forget how total it was. Napoleon's armies moved faster than their opponents, partly because they travelled lighter in terms of supply trains, living off the land ahead of them, but the men themselves were not light. They were heavily laden, moderately paid, and expected to cover 30 kilometers in a day as a reasonable expectation, and more than that when the situation required, and the situation often required it. Men collapsed on the march, men died on the march, of exhaustion, of heat in summer, of cold in the Russian campaign of 1812 when the conditions exceeded any reasonable human threshold. The road itself was a form of attrition that preceded the battle entirely, and by the time a fusilier reached the field where he would be asked to fire 2 to 3 rounds per minute in the direction of another army, he had already paid a considerable price simply in the currency of his own body. Now, against all of this, set the pay. The official daily pay of a French infantry private, a fusilier, was somewhere in the range of 30 to 45 centimes per day, or in the older accounting, a few sous, depending on the year and the source and which deductions one is counting. To give that number a texture, a livre of bread in civilian life might cost 10 or 15 centimes in a year of normal harvests, so on paper the pay bought something, but the army did not operate on paper. It operated on a system called la masse, a company fund into which a portion of every soldier's pay was automatically redirected to cover the collective costs of the unit. Clothing replacement, equipment maintenance, the repair of what the road and the weather and the fighting had destroyed. The soldier's wages flowed into this fund before they ever reached his hand, and the deductions, the stoppages, the small and relentless subtractions did not stop there. The result was that what actually arrived in a man's palm on payday, when payday arrived at all, which was not always, was sometimes only a few centimes, the smallest coins in circulation, enough to buy a cup of something in a tavern, if a tavern existed, not enough to matter in any larger sense, larger. The soldiers were not surprised by this. They understood it as the condition of their station, the way a river understands that it runs downhill. What they had, in lieu of actual wages, was the official ration, and on paper the official ration was a more substantial promise than the pay: 750 grams of bread per day, or biscuit when bread was unavailable, which it often was. 250 grams of meat, dried vegetables, rice, salt, a wine ration or, in some contexts and seasons, an eau de vie, a brandy, the small burning measure that cut the cold and the fear and made the march feel briefly possible again. In garrison, in the comfortable intervals of the war, some approximation of this ration actually arrived. The bakeries worked, the supply wagons came, the men ate something resembling the stated allowance and slept under something resembling adequate shelter, and the army maintained a kind of theoretical plausibility. But the French army under Napoleon was not primarily a garrison army. It was an army of movement, of rapid advance, the core system that swept across Europe at a pace that astonished and alarmed everyone watching. And that pace came at a cost. The supply wagons could not always follow. The bakeries were somewhere behind, in a town 3 days back, and the column was already 3 days ahead of where the food had expected it to be. The ration collapsed. Not always dramatically, not all at once, but repeatedly in the grinding, ordinary way that things collapse when the system's theoretical design and its practical reality begin to separate from each other. Napoleon understood this, and his understanding was encoded in a doctrine so blunt it barely disguised itself as philosophy. La guerre doit nourrir la guerre. War must feed war. The army moving through a territory was expected to extract from that territory what the territory could provide: bread from the mills, meat from the livestock, wine from the cellars, fodder for the horses from the fields. This was accomplished through requisition, formal demands made on the local authorities or the inhabitants of a town or village, structured, theoretically ordered, different in its paperwork from outright theft. A commissary officer would arrive, present a document, list the requirements, and the community was expected to produce them. Sometimes compensation was offered, vouchers redeemable against the French state, the value of which depended entirely on how the war was going and whether France would still exist in its current form when the bearer tried to collect. But requisition, which was at least a transaction with the pretense of formality, shaded constantly and easily into something that had no such pretense: maraudage. Foraging in the softer translation, or marauding in the honest one. A private soldier, hungry enough, cold enough, frightened enough, separated from his unit by 50 yards and a hedge and an hour of confusion, made his own arrangements with the local larder. Chickens disappeared, wine jugs emptied. The locked room turned out not to be locked to a determined man with a musket and nothing to eat. Officers were supposed to prevent this. Regulations existed against it. Courts-martial were theoretically available. And in periods of calm, in occupied territories that France needed to administer without destroying, real effort was made to suppress the worst of it. But the man was hungry, and the chicken was there, and the distance between those two facts was, in the long run, often not very far. In Spain especially, where the guerrilla war that French soldiers called simply La Guerrilla turned the whole country into a landscape of ambush and reprisal, maraudage became something harder to name with a single word. A soldier who left the column was at risk of not returning, not because he had deserted, but because he had been killed by irregulars, by the armed population of a country that the French occupation had turned implacably hostile. And yet men left the column because they were starving, and the villages they visited were visited with a violence that was part hunger and part fear and part the particular cruelty that comes from an occupying army that has learned to see the civilian population as simultaneously the enemy and the source of supply. Saragossa, the sieges of it, the street-by-street fighting, produced scenes that entered the memory of the war as emblems of what a city looked like when military logic and civilian survival collided absolutely. The sack of towns in Spain was not an aberration. It was a consequence following from the doctrine that war must feed itself, that war is its own economy, that what the army needs, the army will find. The private soldier was the end point of that chain, the man through whose hands the looted watch, the grabbed chicken, the lifted coin passed from whoever had possessed it into the informal economy of the campaign. This was, in the plainest terms, a wage supplement. The state was not paying these men enough to live on in any civilian sense. The ration was real, but unreliable. What filled the gap was what the road provided, what the farmhouse yielded, what the body on the field gave up when the battle was over, and the men moved through it in the particular silence that follows a day of musket fire and close work. A soldier's pack might contain, alongside the regulation items, a silver spoon, a pocket watch, a handful of coins in a currency that would be worth something in the next town they passed through, a piece of cloth that could be traded for bread. These things were not issued, they were found. They were the real wages of the campaign, the payment the state could not afford or would not make. None of this was secret. Officers who had not lost their heads entirely knew it and accommodated it, within limits that shifted with the situation. The limits were loosest after a storm, after the city walls came down, and the formal military action ended, and the informal one began. But here is what must also be said. Here, in the cool of the account, holding the whole thing steadily, the private soldier who walked into Spain or Prussia or the Polish winter, carrying his 30 kilograms and his few centimes and his reasonable expectation of supplementing his income from the nearest available source, that man was also the bottom of a ladder. And the ladder was real. This is the thing about Napoleon's army that distinguished it from almost every army then existing in Europe, and that made it, for all its brutality and its absurd demands on the human body, a genuinely different proposition from what had come before. The ladder was real, and it went very high, and the way a man climbed it was not by the name he had been born with or the blood he carried in his veins, but by what he could do when it mattered. La carrière ouverte au talent. Careers open to talent. The phrase sounds like a motto, the kind of thing written on walls and forgotten. In this army, it was close enough to operational practice to change lives. The first rung above the private was the caporal, the corporal. This was a small step in one sense. A corporal commanded a squad, a handful of men, earned a little more, wore a small additional marking on his sleeve and a significant one in another, because it was the first promotion a man could achieve entirely on the basis of the opinion his superiors held of him. There was no purchase involved, no family connection required, no letter from a well-placed uncle that needed to be produced and read and considered. A corporal was a corporal because someone who had watched him had decided he was worth the distinction. That principle, applied all the way to the top of the structure, was what made this army remarkable. Above the corporal was the sergeant, and above him the sergeant major and the adjutant, the senior NCOs who ran the actual daily life of a company with a completeness that the officers, many of whom were busy being officers in the atmospheric sense rather than the administrative one, depended on entirely. The sergeant major in particular occupied a position of real practical authority. He kept the company books, he managed the mass, the company fund, the pool of money into which the soldiers' deductions flowed and from which the collective costs were paid. He knew exactly how much money the company had, how much it owed, how much it had spent on boots and coat repairs and replacement equipment, and he was the man whose arithmetic determined whether the soldiers at the bottom actually received anything at the end of the accounting period or whether the fund had absorbed it all. This was the first point on the ladder where literacy and numeracy became not just useful, but structurally necessary. The sergeant major who could not read the orders that came down from above, who could not write the reports that were expected to go up, who could not add and subtract the columns of the company accounts without making errors that would eventually attract attention. That man could not hold the position. And this was the hidden mechanism inside the celebrated meritocracy, the thing that the phrase careers open to talent did not quite spell out, but that the system enforced anyway. Talent, in this army, meant combat courage certainly, the willingness to advance when everything in the body said stop, the ability to stay functional in the noise and smoke and terror of a firefight. But talent also meant the ability to read, to write, to keep accounts that added up correctly. The army ran on paper as well as on powder, and the men who could navigate both the battlefield and the ledger were the ones the system rewarded. This was not in 1800 as obvious as it sounds now. Literacy in rural France was uneven. A young man from a prosperous family in a town with a good school might arrive in the ranks able to read and write fluently. A young man from a village in a remote province might arrive able to do neither. The army was not a school, except insofar as ambition made it one. A man who understood that the sergeant major's position required letters and numbers, and who wanted that position badly enough, might find ways to acquire them. A fellow soldier who could teach, a chaplain, a schoolmaster in a winter billet, the slow, painful private education of a man who understood that his advancement depended on it. The army's meritocracy was real, but it selected for men who had already found a way to become capable, and capability, in the full sense, required access to education that was itself unequally distributed. The ladder was real and open, but its first rungs were easier to grip if your hands had been prepared. Still, men climbed it who had arrived with almost nothing. Jean-Roch Coignet arrived in the army as a peasant orphan, without the literacy that the higher ranks would require. He was brave, and he was noticed for his bravery, and the army promoted him, and at a certain point in that ascent, he understood that the further rungs required of him something he did not have. He learned to read and write as an adult, in his 30s, sitting somewhere between campaigns with the determination of a man who had decided that the ladder existed and that he was going to keep climbing it. He did not descend. He continued upward, and he received the Légion d'honneur, and he became an officer, and he wrote a memoir that people still read today because the things he saw and the life he led were, in the most precise sense, remarkable. He is T1 evidence, first-hand, named, documented, that the promise was not merely decorative. Men actually lived it. The sergeant major who had mastered the mass and could write a clear report and had also demonstrated the kind of coolness under fire that made officers recommend him. That man could be commissioned as sous-lieutenant on the field. This was not a theoretical avenue occasionally used in exceptional circumstances. It was a recognized and practiced channel, especially in the middle years of the empire, when casualties among officers created openings faster than the formal schools could fill them, and when the army had learned to look at the competent NCO standing in front of it and see the practical solution to an immediate problem. One morning, a man was a sergeant major, keeping the mass and writing the company accounts, and sleeping in slightly better quarters than the privates around him. The next morning, or the morning after a battle in which he had done something that could not be ignored, he was a sous-lieutenant with a completely different set of obligations and a completely different set of expenses and a salary that was on paper dramatically higher than what he had been earning. The NCO who reached that commission was crossing a line that most European armies of the period treated as nearly absolute. In the Prussian army, in the Austrian army, in the British army, the officer class was substantially a social class, and entry into it from below required either the purchase of a commission, which was a market transaction accessible only to those with significant money, or a social background that the existing officers would recognize and accept. Napoleon's army had turned that logic over and stood on the rubble of it. The revolution had done much of the physical work, purging or driving into exile a large portion of the old noble officer class, and leaving behind an institution that needed competent men and was no longer in a position to be too particular about their family trees. Napoleon had inherited that institution and shaped it, and the result was an officer corps in which well over half, by some careful estimates of the later empire, had risen from the ranks rather than arrived from the drawing rooms of good families. This was extraordinary by the standards of any army then in existence anywhere in Europe. And it produced a fighting force with a particular quality. Officers who had been privates knew, with a granular and physical specificity, what they were asking their men to do. They had carried the 30 kilograms. They had eaten the biscuit when the bread failed. They had stood in the rain and pulled the trigger and heard the click of the misfire and understood in their bodies what that moment cost. They had also, many of them, come up through the mass and the company accounts and understood how the money worked or failed to work or was quietly redirected from where it was supposed to go. This knowledge was not a guarantee of better leadership. Men who had suffered sometimes added their own portion of suffering to those below them. But it was a different kind of knowledge from what a man brought who had arrived in the officers' mess directly from a comfortable childhood, and the army that possessed it moved through Europe with a confidence that the armies opposing it struggled to match. So the private carried his 30 kilograms down the road. He ate what arrived and supplemented it with what the road provided. He received his few centimes after the mass had taken its share. He kept his musket clean because a dirty musket misfired even in dry weather, and a misfire at the wrong moment was the kind of mistake a man only made once. He watched the corporal above him and the sergeant above the corporal and the sergeant major running the accounts, and he understood, or he did not understand, that these ranks above him were reachable by his own performance, that the army would advance him if he gave it reason to. And if he was the kind of man who could read, or who was determined to become one, and if he had the additional quality, rarer, less learnable, of performing well in the moments that determined everything, then the door of la carrière ouverte au talent was in fact open to him. And the distance between his current position and the next rung up was not a matter of money or birth, but of what he was willing to do and capable of becoming. The musket is heavy on his shoulder in the afternoon light. The column stretches ahead and behind, a long dark line of men moving at the army's own pace, which has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with where Napoleon needs them to be, and by when. The road is whatever roads in this part of Europe are, which is to say sometimes cobbled, sometimes dirt, sometimes a question mark of mud that tries to take the boots from a man's feet with every step. The greatcoat in the haversack will be needed tonight if the weather holds in its current direction, which it probably will, because weather in the experience of a French infantry private rarely held in any direction other than the wrong one. He is not thinking about the sergeant major's accounts tonight, and he is not thinking about the Légion d'honneur, and he is not thinking about the innkeeper's son from the south who became something almost too large to hold inside the imagination. He is thinking about the weight on his back and the blisters on his feet and the question of whether there is anything in the next village worth looking for, and whether the wine will be drinkable, and whether the column will stop before dark, or whether they will march into the evening as they did 2 days ago, the road barely visible, the man in front of him just a darker shape in the darkness ahead. But the ladder is there. He does not have to understand it fully for it to be real. The sergeant major understands it. The sous-lieutenant who was once a sergeant major understands it. The colonel at the head of the column has understood something about it that the private at the back has not yet had occasion to learn. And at the very top, so far above the road that it occupies a different order of reality entirely, there are men who carried this same musket, wore these same blisters, ate this same insufficient ration, and are now something the vocabulary of the old world does not quite have a word for. Men who started from nothing or nearly nothing and arrived somewhere that nothing before this army and this moment in history could have taken them. The column moves, the haversack shifts on his shoulders. Somewhere in the giberne at his hip, 50 cartridges wait for a moment he cannot yet see. And behind him, receding with every step, the urn sits in the town hall, empty now, the numbered tickets already drawn, the village already divided into those who walked and those who did not. The first decision was made for him, by chance or by the small of his parents' purse. The next decisions will be his to make. That is, in the plainest terms, the bargain. And somewhere ahead on the same road, though further, much further, at a distance that most men will never close, the ladder continues upward into ranks where the pay is not a few centimes, but thousands of francs, where the horse beneath a man is not a borrowed question, but a purchased certainty, where the uniform is not issued, but bought and fitted and represents in its tailoring the distance a man has travelled from the town hall and the urn. The names of those ranks are still ahead of us. The money they pay, the fortunes they build and destroy, the specific men who walked this same road and arrived somewhere extraordinary, all of that is still to come. For now the column walks, the weight is what it is, the road does not explain itself, and the fusilier, the private, the man at the bottom of the most mobile social structure in the history of European warfare, puts one foot in front of the other and moves toward whatever the army has decided he is moving toward, carrying on his back the whole economy of his situation, the real wage and the nominal one, the promise and the price, the baton that may or may not be in his knapsack, and the 30 kilograms that are certainly, undeniably, unmistakably there. The road eventually opens. Not for everyone, and not at once, but for those who could read. There is that word again, and we will return to it. And for those who survived long enough and showed the particular quality of steadiness under fire that sergeants notice and colonels remember, the road eventually genuinely opens. To understand what it meant to hold a commission in Napoleon's army, to be a sous-lieutenant, the most junior officer, the man just one rung above the sergeant major he may have been only a season ago, you have to understand first what was different about this officer corps from any that had existed before it in European history. Because the difference was not incidental, it was the whole point. In the armies of the old European powers, an officer's commission was a property. You bought it, or your family bought it for you, or it passed to you through the right name and the right blood. In the British Army of the same period, the purchase system meant that a wealthy young man with no military experience whatsoever could leapfrog men who had spent a decade learning the trade, simply because his family could afford the price of a captaincy or a lieutenancy on the open market. In the Prussian and Austrian armies, the officer class was drawn so systematically from the nobility that a man of common birth, however gifted, however brave, was effectively sealed off from the upper rungs by the accident of his parentage. The armies of the Old World were, in this sense, extensions of the social order they defended, hierarchical, inherited, closed. The French Revolution destroyed this. It did so not entirely from idealism, though idealism played its part, but from necessity. When the noble officer class emigrated or fled the guillotine in the early 1790s, the revolutionary armies were left with enormous gaps in their command structure, gaps that had to be filled somehow, and they were filled from below. Men who had been sergeants became captains. Men who had been corporals became lieutenants. The habit formed, and it did not stop forming. By the time Napoleon consolidated the army around himself, the principle was already embedded. The career is open to talent. La carrière ouverte au talent. Not a slogan, a structural reality. By the later years of the empire, something remarkable had settled into the officer corps. A large share, by some careful estimates well over half, of the officers serving in Napoleon's armies had risen from the ranks. They had been fusiliers once, or sergeants, or adjutants. They wore their commissions because someone above them had seen something worth promoting. This was, by the standards of the age, almost incomprehensible. In the armies arrayed against France across Europe, the equivalent was essentially unimaginable. And so when a sergeant received a field commission, when a colonel or a general scrawled his name onto a document that transformed him overnight from an NCO into a sous lieutenant, the transformation was real, but it was also immediately expensive. A sous lieutenant earned, in theory, something on the order of 1,000 francs a year and above, depending on the branch and the period. Set against the Fusilier's derisory few centimes per day, this was a different world. 1,000 francs a year was a working man's wages in peacetime France, roughly what a skilled craftsman or a prosperous peasant might see in 12 months of steady labor. For a man who had been earning almost nothing in the ranks, it felt at first like wealth. It was not wealth, it was a starting salary with a list of mandatory expenditures attached that for the first years of an officer's career had a habit of exceeding the income. Here is the thing about becoming an officer in Napoleon's army that no one in the village mentioned when the urn was being carried to the town hall. An officer bought his own everything. The private was issued his kit, or had it charged against his mass, which was almost the same as being issued it. But the officer was expected to appear properly dressed and equipped entirely at his own cost. The uniform alone was a substantial investment. The dark blue coat with its branch-colored facings, the gilt or silver buttons depending on rank and regiment, the sash and the sword, a proper officer's sword, not the heavy saber of the ranks but a lighter, finer weapon with a decorated hilt. All of it had to be purchased, and all of it had to be maintained, and all of it had to be replaced when campaign destroyed it, which campaign reliably did. Then there was the horse. An officer was expected to be mounted, at least once he rose past the most junior grades, and the question of the horse sat at the center of an officer's financial life the way the question of the lottery ticket sat at the center of a conscript's, a trained cavalry horse. And it had to be trained, a horse that would hold its nerve under artillery fire and not shy from the smell of blood, was not a common animal, could cost several hundred francs. In a cavalry regiment where an officer might need 2 horses, one for battle and one for the road, the investment could approach or exceed an entire year's pay before a shot had been fired. Add the saddlery, the housing, the feed, the farrier's work, and the constant attrition that campaign inflicted on horseflesh, and a cavalry officer was managing what was essentially a small and very fragile livestock operation in the middle of a war. The infantry officer had it somewhat easier in this regard, at least at the junior grades. But the uniform costs, the sword, the mess expenses, the expectation that an officer would maintain a certain appearance in front of his men, all of this pressed on the finances of a young man who had risen from the ranks with no inherited capital and nothing behind him but his own pay packet and whatever small savings his years as a sergeant had permitted him to accumulate. Many were chronically in debt. This was not considered unusual. The memoirs of the period take it as a given, the way they take cold bivouacs and bad rations as given. It was simply the shape of the thing. Jean-Roch Coignet knew this shape intimately. His story is worth sitting with because it is the most vivid and documented example of what la carrière ouverte au talent actually looked like when you followed it all the way down to its root. Coignet was born in 1776 in a village in Burgundy to a family poor enough and troubled enough that he was effectively orphaned by circumstance at a young age and spent his early years working on other people's land for other people's bread. He could not read, he could not write. He had received no education of any kind worth naming, because education was not something that reached men of his station in the France of that era through any reliable channel. He was, by the measures his society applied, at the very bottom of what it was possible to be without being actually a criminal. He was conscripted, he marched, and somewhere in those first years of marching, something in him caught the eye of someone above him, and he distinguished himself in the way that the army rewarded, with fire in the line, with steadiness in a retreat, with whatever quality of presence and reliability and visible courage it was, that sergeants and adjutants reported upward through the chain until a name attached itself to a reputation. He rose, not immediately, not easily, but steadily. He was eventually admitted to the Imperial Guard, the Garde Impériale, entry to which required years of verified service and a clean record of valor. And the Guard was Napoleon's inner circle, the army's army, and membership in it was itself a form of recognition that most men never received. And then came the moment that is quietly extraordinary about Coignet's story. When the time came to advance further, to hold a commission rather than carry one out, he could not do it. Not because of courage, not because of character, not because of any deficiency in military skill, but because he could not read the orders he would be required to process. He could not write the reports. An illiterate man, however brave, could not run a company's paperwork, could not manage the masses' accounts, could not correspond with the regimental staff. The army required it, and the army on this point did not bend. So Coignet learned to read. He was in his 30s. The fact of this, a grown man, a veteran of some of the most brutal fighting in Europe, sitting down to learn his letters like a child, is almost too improbable to sit comfortably inside the mind, and yet it is what happened. His memoir records it without false modesty and without exaggeration. He learned because he had to, because the next rung required it, and because he had come too far to stop at the rung where illiteracy would hold him. He achieved his commission. He received the Légion d'honneur. He wrote his memoirs in his own hand, in the plain and vivid French of a man who had learned the language as a working tool and used it as one. And those memoirs have been read by historians ever since as one of the most direct windows into what the common soldier's life actually felt like from the inside. Coignet's story is not a legend, it is documented. The man existed, the arc was real, and the arc says something very precise about the system that made it possible. The Légion d'honneur itself deserves a moment here because it was not simply a medal. Napoleon created it in 1802, and the act was deliberate in a way that repays attention. The Legion was designed from the start to be open to every rank. A private could receive the same red ribbon on the same dark coat as a general, could stand at the same ceremony, could look the same officer in the eye across the shared fact of that ribbon. This was symbolically radical in an age when the difference between a nobleman and a commoner was legible at a glance in the cut and quality of every piece of clothing either wore. But the Legion was not only symbolic. Attached to the award was a pension, small, certainly in absolute terms, but real. A legionnaire at the base grade received something on the order of 250 francs a year, rising through the higher grades of the order toward much larger sums. For a common soldier who had survived years of campaign, who was perhaps wounded, who had returned to a village with no other income and no other prospects, 250 francs was not nothing. It was the state's acknowledgement in hard money that the service had been real, that the risk had been real, that the man who took it was owed something beyond the promise of glory. Honor, convertible to money, convertible to status. The ribbon that a man wore on his chest opened doors, in a cafe, in a shop, in the small daily negotiations of life in a provincial town, that would have remained closed to him before. Napoleon understood the mechanism very precisely. He was not sentimental about it. He knew that men who could be bound to the regime by honor and by money were men who would fight to preserve the system that awarded both. The Légion d'honneur was a technology of loyalty, and it worked. But there is another rung to climb before we reach the summit, and it is a rung that is less studied than the marshals and less romanticized than the privates, and it is perhaps for that reason more revealing than either. The colonel commanding a regiment stood at the midpoint of the whole structure, high enough to have a genuine view of it, senior enough to control real money, not yet elevated to the level where the numbers ceased to be legible as numbers and became instead political arrangements and endowed estates. The colonel was, in the plainest sense, the man who ran the machine. And the machine involved a great deal of money. A colonel's base pay ran somewhere in the range of 4,000 to 9,000 francs a year, depending on the regiment type, the branch, and the period. A cavalry colonel earning more than his infantry counterpart, a colonel of the guard earning more than a colonel of the line. These are not small sums. For comparison, a skilled Parisian craftsman in the same period might earn somewhere between 400 and 700 francs in a good year. The colonel's base pay at the lower end of its range was already 6 to 10 times that. At the upper end, it was more. But the colonel's real financial position was not determined by his pay. It was determined by his relationship to the regimental finances, a domain that combined the power and the temptations of a small business owner with the accountability structures of a military hierarchy. Which is to say, the accountability existed, but it was imperfect, and the space between what was required and what was verified was sometimes wide enough to accommodate considerable creativity. The regiment handled large sums. Pay for every soldier passed through the regimental accounts. The mass, that company fund from which clothing, equipment upkeep, and small expenses were drawn, was administered at the company level, but overseen at the regimental level. Clothing contracts meant that someone had to negotiate with suppliers, approve deliveries, certify that the coats and breeches and gaiters had arrived in the quantity and quality specified. Remounts, the replacement horses for a cavalry regiment, meant that someone had to purchase animals at market at prices that varied and that could be recorded with a degree of flexibility. The supply of bread and rations passed through accounts that had to be reconciled against what soldiers actually received, and the reconciliation was, in practice, often approximate. None of this is to say that every colonel was dishonest. Many were scrupulously honest, and their regimental accounts showed it, and their men were well fed and properly clothed as a consequence. But the structure also created genuine opportunities for corruption, and those opportunities were taken. The most classical form was the ghost soldier, a man who had died of fever, or been killed in action, or deserted, whose name remained on the regimental rolls, whose pay and ration allocation continued to be drawn, and whose theoretical existence quietly enriched whoever controlled the accounts. This practice was not unique to France, nor to this period. It was a recurring feature of armies throughout history, wherever pay was distributed by unit and accountability was distant and intermittent. But in the Grande Armée, with its enormous size and its constant movement, it was a recurring scandal, and Napoleon periodically and angrily purged the worst offenders. The clothing contract was another avenue. A colonel who directed his regiment's uniform procurement toward a specific supplier, and who received in return some form of consideration, a percentage of the contract, a gift, a favorable price on a personal purchase, was engaging in what modern language would call corruption, and what the period called, with rather more tolerance, les arrangements. The tolerance was not unlimited. Officers were cashiered and occasionally prosecuted. But the threshold for intervention was high enough that the practice was common, and the men who suffered for it were the fusiliers in thin coats and the sergeants in worn-out boots, the ones whose mass funded the arrangement without their knowledge or consent. It is worth pausing here on this detail because it illustrates something important about the structure of the whole army. The system of la carrière ouverte au talent was genuinely meritocratic at the level of combat promotion. The soldier who showed himself brave and capable in battle was, more than in any other army of the period, likely to advance. But the financial machinery surrounding that system was not meritocratic in the same way. It rewarded those with access, with literacy, with numerical competence, with the social intelligence to navigate patronage networks, with the moral flexibility to take advantage of gaps in oversight. These qualities were not evenly distributed, and they did not correspond in any simple way to courage under fire. A brilliant sergeant might become a courageous officer and remain financially at the mercy of a dishonest colonel. The system was not pure. No system is. What the colonel's position also provided beyond the pay and the access and the financial opportunity, honest and otherwise, was proximity to those above him, to the General de Brigade, to the General de Division, to the marshals and to Napoleon himself, in whose gift the really transformative rewards lay. The colonel who managed his regiment well, who kept his accounts clean, who moved his men effectively and showed himself reliable in the field, was the man whose name appeared in the reports that went upward through the chain, and whose name, when the time came to promote someone to General de Brigade, was already there, already attached to a record, already legible as a candidate for something larger. This was how the dotations worked. Or rather, this was how you positioned yourself to receive one. The dotation was an endowed income, a grant from Napoleon of annual revenues from specific conquered territories, typically attached to a title. A count might receive a dotation of 20 or 30,000 francs a year from estates in the German states or in Poland or in Italy, lands that Napoleon had won in battle and was now distributing to the men who had helped him win them. This was the mechanism by which the noblesse d'empire, or the empire's new nobility, was created. Not by blood, but by service, certified by the emperor himself and expressed in the language of land and income. The dotation bound the recipient to the regime in the most direct way imaginable. Your income came from conquered land. Conquered land was held only as long as France remained victorious. Your fortune and the army's fortunes were quite literally the same fortune. A marshal or a general who received a dotation in the Kingdom of Westphalia or in the Duchy of Warsaw had every personal financial reason to want France to keep winning, because the alternative was not simply a change of government, but the evaporation of the income that kept his household running, his servants paid, and his mansion in Paris furnished. But before we reach those mansions, there is one more element of the middle officer's world worth settling carefully: the horse. We have touched on the horse already in the context of the cavalry officer's expenditure, but the horse deserves its own careful attention because it appears at every level of the hierarchy above the fusilier, and what it costs and what it means shifts at each level in ways that illuminate the whole structure. At the level of the junior officer, or be the sous-lieutenant or lieutenant in a cavalry regiment, the horse was a personal investment, typically 1 or 2 animals representing a substantial portion of a year's pay bought from the officer's own pocket or borrowed against future income. When the horse died, in a charge, from exhaustion on a long march, from the cold of a Russian winter, the loss was immediate and personal. The officer had to find another horse at market price, in conditions where horses were scarce and expensive, while simultaneously continuing to perform his duties, which required him to be mounted. Some officers borrowed from comrades, some fell further into debt, some petitioned the regimental fund for assistance. The horse was not just a military asset, it was a recurring financial crisis held at a temporary distance by the fact that the current horse was still alive. At higher levels, this dynamic scaled rather than simplified. A colonel might maintain several horses, a battle horse, a road horse, perhaps a horse for his aide, and the total represented a capital investment that his pay supported only because the pay was now substantially larger. A general might maintain a small stable with grooms, with farriers' accounts, with hay and fodder costs that ran year-round, regardless of whether the army was in the field. The horses of the imperial general staff were, in their way, a miniature version of the great logistics problem that the army as a whole was always fighting. You needed them, you couldn't easily replace them, they cost more than almost anything else, and the campaign that worked too hard ate them. The 1812 Russian campaign would answer the question of what happened when the horse problem was taken to its limit. But that answer belongs to the next part of the ascent, the summit and the fall, and we are not there yet. For now, consider the officer of common birth standing somewhere in the middle of this structure, past the lottery, past the fusilier's pack, past the sergeant major's account books, into a rank where the pay is real, and the debt is real, and the horse is real, and the uniform on his back represents, in its blue wool and its bright facings, a distance travelled from a village and an urn that most men in that village could not have imagined. He is probably tired, he is probably in debt. He may be owed back pay from a campaign that moved too fast for the paymaster to keep up, a common enough situation in an army that lived off the land and whose financial administration was always slightly behind the military reality. He writes his reports because he can write, or has learned to write, the way Coignet learned. And he checks his accounts and he watches his horse with a proprietorial anxiety that the fusilier in the ranks cannot quite understand, because the fusilier has no horse to lose. But he is an officer. He wears the ribbon, perhaps, if he has distinguished himself, the Légion d'honneur, small and red, on his chest, and when he passes a private on the road, the private snaps to attention, and that gesture, small and reflexive and entirely routine, is the physical expression of the whole distance he has come. The Jourdan-Delbrel lottery put a number in his hand. His own qualities? And luck? Always luck? You cannot take the luck out. Carried him past the pack and the mass and the sergeant major's bookkeeping into a world where a man is saluted rather than commanded. Whether the rungs above him are reachable is a different question. The colonel's position is visible, ambitious, possible, for the right man. Beyond the colonel, the general's grade, and beyond that, at the very top of what the army's structure can produce, the thing that organized the whole system's romance from the beginning, the bâton de maréchal. The ladder still goes upward. The next rungs are where the fortunes become enormous, and where the names become, in some cases, the names of kings. But here, at this level, the officer of common birth has already done something that no previous European army would have permitted him to do. He has climbed on the basis of what he could do, not on the basis of who his father was or how much his family could spend on a commission. That is not nothing. In the scale of European social history, it is very nearly everything. It is the thing that made men fight, not the centimes, not the ration of wine, not the promise of a baton that most of them would never hold, but the actual, demonstrated, witnessed reality that the man next to you in the line might, if he survived and distinguished himself and could manage the arithmetic of the mass, become your superior officer by the end of the decade. The system worked on the watching of it. You did not have to rise yourself to believe in the possibility of rising, because you could see the men who had. And Coignet, sitting somewhere with his pen and his hard-learned letters, writing down what it felt like from the inside, is the proof that the watching was not false. The document is there. The man was there. The ribbon was on his coat, and he had earned it in the plainest possible way, by surviving what was meant to survive him, and by learning what he needed to learn to go further when the road required it. That is the officer of common birth. That is the rung where the revolution's promise met the army's daily reality and produced something that the old world would not have recognized and could not have sanctioned, and that Napoleon, who was himself, after all, a Corsican artillery officer of minor provincial nobility, risen to the summit of France by exactly this mechanism, understood as the engine of everything. The colonel's accounts are balanced, or approximately balanced, or balanced well enough to pass inspection. The horse is fed. The mass is administered. The dispatch is written and sent. The road goes upward. The next rank has its own economy, its own mathematics of fortune and ruin, its own specific men who walked it, men whose names, even now, attached to countries and dynasties and battles carved into stone in a dozen European capitals. Those men are ahead of us on the same road that began in the village and the urn, and what they earned and what it cost them is a story that the narration has been holding open since it began. And so we arrive at the summit, not as a metaphor, not as a figure of speech chosen for effect, as a literal, documented, legally constituted rank that Napoleon created on the 18th of May, 1804, when he transformed the Republic's generals into something the French language had not heard in a generation, maréchaux d'empire, marshals of the empire, the highest military dignity the new France could confer. 18 were named that first day, 26 in total across the years that followed, as the wars consumed some and the emperor rewarded others, and the list grew with the territory of his ambitions. They were given a physical object to mark the summit because Napoleon understood that great men are bound to great regimes, partly by symbols, partly by salaries, and very largely by the particular weight of a thing they can hold in their hands. The object was the bâton de maréchal, the marshal's baton, a cylinder of blue velvet about 40 centimeters long, studded with golden eagles, embroidered with gold thread, bearing on its surface an inscription in Latin, Terra belli, decus pacis, terror in war, ornament in peace. A man who held it was meant to embody both things simultaneously, the capacity for complete destruction in the field and the composed, ornamented dignity of the state at rest. It weighed very little physically. The power it represented was of an altogether different order. The pay that accompanied it was extraordinary. A marshal's annual income from his base salary alone was measured in the tens of thousands of francs. Already, by any measure of the time, a sum beyond the arithmetic of almost everyone who served beneath him. But the base salary was not really the point. The point was the dotation. Napoleon had built his new aristocracy, the noblesse d'empire, the service nobility of merit rather than blood, on a very specific economic logic. He gave his marshals and his senior commanders titles, grand and sonorous titles, drawn from the places where they had won their greatest victories: Prince of Eckmühl, Duke of Auerstedt, Prince of Neuchâtel, Duke of Montebello. And attached to those titles he gave them dotations, endowed annual incomes drawn from the revenues of conquered territories, from the lands and customs and estates of the peoples France had defeated and absorbed. These dotations were not small. For the most favored marshals, the annual income from a dotation could run to hundreds of thousands of francs. The difference between that and the private's few sous after deductions is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of species. It is the distance between a man who could not afford to eat reliably and a man whose single year's income could have bought a small town. The logic that underpinned it was deliberate and cold-eyed. Napoleon had watched the old French nobility, with its inherited privileges and its loyalty to bloodlines rather than to the state, collapse and burn in the Revolution. He did not intend to rebuild that. What he built instead was a nobility whose titles were real and hereditary, but whose fortunes were tied with an almost mechanical directness to the continuation of his victories. A dotation drawn from the revenues of Warsaw or Naples or the German principalities was worth everything while France held those territories, and nothing at all the moment it did not. His marshals were rich because he was winning. The connection was not incidental, it was the whole point. Their loyalty was not purchased by sentiment, it was purchased by the structure of their balance sheets. Consider what this meant for the men who climbed from nothing to that summit. And they did climb from nothing, not as a romantic exaggeration, not as the kind of story that accrues around great events to make them feel more significant than they were, but as a documented, verifiable, checkable biographical fact about specific men whose origins and whose endings are both on the record. Joachim Murat was born in 1767 in La Bastide-Fortunière, a village in the Lot, to an innkeeper. His father ran an inn. Murat grew up in the smell of straw and horses and travellers' muddy boots, in the casual noise of a roadside establishment that served passing trade in a part of France that was not particularly prosperous and was not particularly anything. He joined the army before the Revolution, served in the Royal Cavalry, got himself expelled for insubordination, rejoined when the Revolution changed the rules about who could stay and who could go, and then he rose. He rose at a pace that had no precedent and no parallel in the world before Napoleon made it possible. By 1804 he was a marshal, by 1806 he was a Grand Duke. By 1808 he was King of Naples, ruling a Mediterranean kingdom from a palace, having married Caroline Bonaparte, the Emperor's own sister, and having transformed himself within a single lifetime from an innkeeper's son who had once been discharged for disobedience into a crowned head of state. This is not mythology. The palace exists, the records exist, the marriage certificate exists, the man exists in the documentary record from the inn in the Lot to the throne in Naples, and every step between those 2 points is traceable if you wish to trace it. Or take Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. He was born in 1763 in Pau in the Pyrenean foothills, the son of a lawyer's clerk. He joined the Royal Infantry as a private soldier in 1780 before the Revolution, when promotion for a man of his background was essentially capped at sergeant, and the officer class was legally and socially closed to him. The Revolution opened the cap. He rose steadily and on demonstrated competence. By 1804, he was among Napoleon's 18 original marshals. He received the title Prince of Pontecorvo. He commanded, administered, politicked, and maneuvered through the years that followed with the particular combination of military ability and political intelligence that his particular mind possessed. And then, in 1810, the Estates of Sweden, looking for a successor to a throne with no heir, looking for a soldier of reputation who might protect their country in a dangerous Europe, elected him Crown Prince of Sweden. He converted from Catholicism to Lutheranism. He took the name Karl Johan. He became, in 1818, King of Sweden. He founded a dynasty. His descendants sit on the Swedish throne today. The current royal house of Sweden descends in an unbroken line from a sergeant's son out of Pau, who drew a good number in the lottery of the Revolutionary Wars and never stopped climbing once the door was open. If you want the single most verifiable proof that the phrase about the marshal's baton was not empty rhetoric, this is it. Not a man who wore a crown for a season and died obscure. A royal house, a lineage, a dynasty that governs a modern European nation in the 21st century, rooted in the biography of a man who began his life as a private soldier and who would have remained one entirely under any system that preceded the one the Revolution and Napoleon built, and Michel Ney, the cooper's son. His father made barrels, wooden barrels, a skilled trade, but a manual one, the trade of a working craftsman in Sarre-Louis, a town in the Moselle that was French territory when Ney was born there in 1769. He joined the Hussars in 1787 before the Revolution. As a private, he was brave in a way that attracted notice and then promotion and then command. Napoleon called him the bravest of the brave, le brave des braves, a phrase that, like all Napoleon's best phrases, was designed for the record and for the man's loyalty simultaneously. Ney rose to marshal in 1804 to Prince of the Moskva in 1812, after the battle by the river in Russia that carried that name, a title bestowed at the very moment the campaign that should have cemented everything was beginning to consume everything instead. He was a cooper's son who became a prince. The title was real, the patent of nobility was real, the palace and the income and the place at the emperor's table, all real. Jean Lannes. He was born in 1769 in Lectoure in Gascony, the son of a stable hand. Some sources say a small tradesman, the distinction between the two being, in the world he grew up in, almost too fine to matter. He joined the National Guard when the Revolution came, rose through the ranks on the extraordinary field talent that men who served with him documented with consistent agreement, became one of Napoleon's earliest and most trusted generals, and received the title Duke of Montebello, named for a battle in northern Italy in 1800 where his conduct had been decisive. Napoleon trusted him with the kind of directness that he trusted very few men. He was not a political animal, he was a soldier. He was the kind of man who said what he thought in a court full of men who said what the emperor wished to hear. And Napoleon, who was not without clear-eyed intelligence about his own situation, valued that. He died at Aspern-Essling in May of 1809 during what was Napoleon's first genuine tactical defeat, a battle near Vienna, along the Danube, where the crossing went wrong and the French were pushed back with serious losses. Lannes was sitting on the ground, resting, when a cannonball came low and shattered both his legs. He was carried from the field. He died 8 days later from his wounds and the infection that followed them, as men almost always died in field medicine of that era when their limbs were destroyed. Napoleon, who was not sentimental and did not weep easily, reportedly wept at the news, and the story of Lannes is part of the ledger too. Not only the rise from the stable-hand son to the Duke of Montebello and the emperor's confidant, but the way the rise ended, on the ground, legs gone, in a campaign that should have been another victory, and was instead a costly stumble on the road toward 1812. The summit did not buy immunity. That was one of the things the summit could not purchase. Marshals died of cannonballs the same way privates died of cannonballs, because the physical fact of an iron ball moving through the air at speed does not negotiate with titles or dotations. The elevation was real, the fortune was real, the social distance between a marshal and the fusilier in his line was almost unbridgeable. But the sky above a battle was the same sky for everyone, and the physics of it were the same, and the man who held the blue velvet baton was not protected from it by any amount of gold thread. Louis-Nicolas Davout, Prince of Eckmühl, Duke of Auerstedt, arguably the most rigidly professional and organizationally competent of all the marshals, drew enormous endowed incomes from his titles and commanded his corps with a relentless administrative discipline that drove his staff to exhaustion and made his formations the most reliable in the army. André Masséna, who was given the title Prince of Essling and whose career stretched back to the Revolutionary Wars, was famous, or perhaps notorious, for something else alongside his military talent, his appetite for the wealth that occupied territories made available to men in his position. In Italy, in Portugal, and across the territories he administered, Masséna extracted money and valuables and art with an enthusiasm that went well beyond the official mechanisms of dotation and requisition. His contemporaries noted it, his enemies documented it, and the historical record confirms it. The wealth that passed through his hands in his years of command was extraordinary by any accounting. War, for Masséna, was not only a military exercise, it was a financial one. And this is the honest thing to say about what the top of the ladder looked like. It looked like genuine, staggering, historically unprecedented enrichment for men who had started with nothing, and it looked like the direct extraction of that wealth from the populations and territories that France's armies moved through. The dotations were not drawn from some abstract fund. They were drawn from real places, from the customs revenues of Warsaw, from the rents of Westphalian estates, from the taxes of Italian principalities. And the people in those places paid them, and they knew it, and the history of that period in those countries is in part the history of paying for the fortunes of French marshals. There was, running beneath all of this, an institution that represented the regime's attempt to do something more structured with the bond between the soldier and the state. The Imperial Guard, La Garde Impériale, was Napoleon's household force, his most trusted reserve, the formation he committed to battle only when the moment was decisive and the situation was serious. It was organized into several layers, of which the innermost and most celebrated was the Old Guard, the Vieille Garde, whose members were known, with a mixture of affection and mild exasperation, as the grognards, the grumblers. To enter the Guard at all, a soldier had to meet requirements that would have been aspirational for most of the men who served in the line. The exact criteria shifted over the years, but the principle was consistent. Years of active service, demonstrated bravery in battle, a minimum height requirement, and a record clean enough to pass inspection. The Old Guard's veterans were men who had been in the army long enough to have seen several campaigns, survived them, and accumulated the kind of specific battlefield experience that produced the particular quality of steadiness that the Guard was supposed to represent. These were not young men eager to prove themselves. They were older soldiers who had already proven whatever needed proving and now served as the hard, experienced core around which the rest of the army organized itself in moments of crisis. They were compensated accordingly. A guardsman ranked above an equivalent soldier in the line. His pay was higher, his rations were better, his uniform was more elaborate and better maintained, and his status within the army's social world was emphatically superior. The private of the Old Guard was addressed as Monsieur by officers of the line. He drew a Fusilier's official pay, roughly, but at a higher grade. The Guard had its own artillery, its own cavalry, its own administration, its own particular esprit, the sense of being a formation set apart, marked out by survival and service, trusted with the decisions that could not be delegated to less certain men. Napoleon cultivated this in them with the particular intimacy he was capable of when it served his purposes. He called them his children, his old grumblers. He knew their names or performed the knowing of their names, which for the purposes of an army in the field amounted to the same thing. He moved among them in his grey coat and let them grumble in his presence in a way that no other soldier in the army would have dared to do in front of the emperor. The grognard who complained loudly about the march, about the rations, about the cold, and did so within earshot of Napoleon without being punished for it, was a specific type, and the license to be that type was itself a form of reward. You had earned the right to grumble because you had earned everything else. But now the road begins to darken. It was always going to. The architecture of the story requires it, and the history insists on it, and anyone who has listened this far has been carrying the weight of what comes next since the beginning. The Légion d'honneur promised its legionnaires a pension. For the base grade, the one a private could reach, the figure was around 250 francs a year. That number needs to stand still for a moment so that what it means is clear. 250 francs a year was not nothing. It was the army taking the idea of a pension seriously enough to write it into the charter of the order, to make it a legal obligation rather than a charitable gift. But 250 francs a year for a man who had marched through 15 years of European wars and come out the other side with a body assembled from whatever the campaigns had left him was not comfort. It was a gesture toward comfort. It was the state acknowledging the obligation and then meeting it at a level that reflected the gap between what the state promised and what the state's treasury, increasingly strained, could actually deliver. The Hôtel des Invalides in Paris housed disabled veterans, men who had lost limbs men whose wounds had left them incapable of working, men whom the army had broken in the most literal physical sense, and who now required the state's provision simply to survive. The institution was real, the care was real, and within its walls men were housed and fed and maintained in something approaching dignity. But the Invalides had a fixed capacity, and the wars produced a number of shattered men that no institution of that kind could have absorbed entirely. The ones inside were fortunate. The ones outside, and there were very many outside, made their way as they could. Many maimed veterans ended in poverty. That is not a soft judgment on the system or a retrospective critique applied from a comfortable distance. It is what the contemporary records show: men on the roads of France, in the streets of its cities, with their military decorations on their chests and their begging bowls in their hands, the ribbon and the poverty existing simultaneously on the same body, which is the most concentrated possible image of the gap between the state's symbolic generosity and its material one. The Légion d'honneur said, "You matter, you are honored, you belong to a great community of service." The 250 francs said, "And here is what we can actually spare." By 1813 and 1814, something had shifted in the conscription system that made everything about the promise feel different from the inside. The wars had been going for a long time. The men who had believed most fully in la carrière ouverte au talent had been, many of them, consuming that career for 15 or 20 years through campaigns that had moved from Italy to Egypt, to Austria, to Prussia, to Spain, to Russia, and back again, covering distances that no previous European army had covered and leaving behind, in those distances, the majority of the men who had set out. The pool of experienced soldiers was not inexhaustible because human bodies are not inexhaustible, and the lottery was reaching deeper and younger to compensate for what the campaigns had consumed. They came to be called the Marie-Louises, the raw conscripts of 1813 and 1814, named for the Empress Marie-Louise, who as regent signed the orders that called them up. They were teenagers, many of them. 16, 17 years old in some cases, pulled from villages and towns before they had done anything that could have prepared them for what they were sent to do. They were given minimal training because there was not time for more than minimal training. They were issued uniforms that did not always fit, and weapons that they had not always learned to use, and sent into campaigns that the more experienced soldiers around them already understood were different in character from what had come before. Not the swift, decisive advances of the Austerlitz years, but the grinding, exhausting, defensive campaigns of a power that had reached the limits of its capacity and was now trying to hold what it had. The men who drew the numbers in those later years were not drawing them in the same emotional atmosphere as the men who had drawn them in 1800 or 1805. The early conscripts had marched out into a war machine that was winning with a consistency that made the risks, however real, feel manageable against the rewards. The Marie-Louises marched out into a war machine that was losing, and that most of the men around them knew was losing. And the promise of advancement that had seemed luminous at the beginning of the empire now had to be weighed against the evidence of what advancement actually looked like at this point in the story. Shorter, colder, harder, with fewer victories to generate the prizes and more campaigns to generate the casualties. And the casualties were not primarily being generated by the enemy. This is the thing that the romance of the period consistently softens because it is less interesting in a narrative sense and more relentless in a physical one. Disease was the great killer of the Napoleonic Wars, as it was the great killer of every European war of that period, because the germ theory of disease was a generation away, and the military medicine of the time operated with no reliable understanding of how infection spread or how to stop it. Typhus killed, dysentery killed, fever killed. Exposure and malnutrition made the body's resistance to all of these things collapse, so that a man who survived the march and the battle and the wound still faced the hospital, which in this period was frequently not a place of recovery, but a place of concentrated infection where men who arrived with a chance of survival encountered the illnesses of the men who had arrived before them and added those to whatever they had already. Roughly speaking, across the Napoleonic Wars as a whole, disease accounted for more deaths than combat did. The exact proportions varied by campaign and by year, but the principle was consistent enough to call it the rule rather than the exception. The conscript who drew his number and marched out was more likely to die of typhus or dysentery or pneumonia or the accumulated damage of cold and hunger than to die in the dramatic cinematic way of a battle. But those deaths, being less legible to narrative, tend not to be the ones that organize the story that most people know. The year 1812 holds all of this together in its most concentrated form. Napoleon assembled what he called the Grande Armée for the invasion of Russia. Roughly 600,000 men drawn from across the empire and its allied and subject states, the largest single military force Europe had ever seen mobilized for a single campaign. The number is accepted in its approximate form by modern scholarship, and it gives a sense of the scale of the enterprise. This was not an army, in the sense of a formation a human mind can easily picture. It was a nation in motion, a country's worth of men, organized for violence and draped across the roads of Eastern Europe in a column that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. They crossed into Russia in June of 1812. The dotations of the marshals, the pay of the soldiers, the regimental funds of the colonels, and the informal economy of the men in the ranks were all pointed at what was expected to be a short, decisive campaign of the type that had produced Austerlitz and Jena and Wagram, a swift advance, a confrontation, a Russian defeat, a favorable treaty, a return. The structure was familiar, the outcome was not. The Russians did not cooperate with the familiar structure. They retreated, and they burned what they retreated from, and the country ahead of the French advance offered progressively less food and fodder as the season went on and the column went deeper. The army's logistical system, la guerre doit nourrir la guerre, the country feeding the war, required a country that had something left to feed it with. The scorched earth of the Russian withdrawal gave the principal no material to work on. They reached Moscow in September. The city was largely abandoned and then set on fire by the Russians who left it, so that what the French occupied was not a functioning capital with the resources a winter in Russia required, but a shell of a city, burning and then cold, offering no negotiation and no supply that was adequate to the situation. Napoleon waited in Moscow for a treaty that did not come. He waited longer than he should have waited because the habit of decisive military outcomes and subsequent negotiations had not prepared him well for an enemy who declined to perform that role. He waited through September and into October, and then the winter came, and he ordered the retreat. What followed is one of the most extensively documented catastrophes in the military history of the world, documented from inside by the men who survived it and wrote memoirs about surviving it, and documented from outside by the physical evidence. The archaeological layers, the bones, the equipment, the coins and buttons and buckles that turn up in the soil of the retreat route that has been accumulating in the earth of Eastern Europe for 2 centuries. The Grande Armée of 600,000 was reduced by the end of the Russian campaign to a remnant of tens of thousands of effective soldiers. The others died of cold, of starvation, of disease, of exhaustion, of the Cossack cavalry that harried the flanks of the retreating column through the snow, of the accumulated weight of everything the campaign had required of them, and that human bodies have a finite capacity to give. They died on the roads in the snow, and the men who died beside them were too weakened to bury them, and the column moved on past the dead and left them where they had fallen. The loot was part of the retreat as well. Moscow had yielded some treasure. silver plate, valuables abandoned by those who fled, the residue of a wealthy city suddenly emptied. Men had taken what they could carry when the retreat began, because this was what soldiers in this army had always done, because the informal economy of the campaign had always supplemented the official one, and because a silver candlestick weighing a kilogram was, in the abstract, worth more than a day's rations. In the abstract. When the temperature fell below freezing and kept falling, and the road ahead was ice and snow, and 150 kilometers to anything resembling safety, the weight of silver became a different kind of calculation. Men dropped their loot. They dropped it on the roads and in the ditches beside the roads, and they died beside it sometimes, unable to go further, lying down in the snow with fortunes they had taken from burning houses in a burning city in a country they had invaded, and which now returned the favor in the most efficient way available to a Russian winter, by simply continuing to be a Russian winter, which it was very good at, while the men in Napoleon's army ran out of what was needed to outlast it. The cavalry arm, which had already been a significant investment, horses costing several hundred francs each, the training and equipping of the arms representing an enormous expenditure of state and regimental funds, was effectively destroyed. Tens of thousands of horses died in Russia. They died of cold and starvation and exhaustion and disease, the same causes as the men, and they died faster in some respects because a horse that can no longer be fed cannot convert its body's reserves to warmth as efficiently as a man can, and the Russian winter of 1812 was not interested in the investment that the French state had made in its cavalry. France never fully rebuilt that cavalry arm before the end. The horses could be replaced in theory. In practice, the breeding and training and time required meant that the mounted arm of the later campaigns was a shadow of what it had been, and the commanders who tried to conduct operations with it knew the difference. The dotations began to come undone in ways that the marshals who held them had not, perhaps, fully reckoned with when they accepted them. A dotation endowed on the revenues of a Polish territory was worth its full value while France held Poland. A dotation endowed on the revenues of a German principality was worth its full value while France held that principality. After 1813, after the catastrophic defeat at Leipzig, the so-called Battle of the Nations in October of that year, where a coalition of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden met the French army and pushed it back across the Rhine, the territories from which the dotations drew their income were no longer French. They were territories again of their former rulers, and the revenues flowed in the directions they had formerly flowed, and the marshals' incomes from those sources shrank and then stopped. The fortunes that had been built on victory were, with considerable directness, being lost with the loss of the victories. The mechanism that had created them was the same mechanism that was now taking them back. Napoleon had designed it that way deliberately, so that his marshal's loyalty would be structural rather than sentimental. And the design worked in both directions. When the victories were happening, the financial incentive to continue them was enormous. When the losses began to mount and the territories began to fall and the dotations began to dry up, the men who had been bound to the regime by the structure of their balance sheets found that the structure itself was unraveling and that their position required a different kind of calculation. After 1814 and then after Waterloo in 1815, the question of what to do with the marshals of Napoleon's army was a political and a personal one simultaneously. Many of them made accommodation with the restored Bourbon monarchy, accepted that the old royal house was returning to France, swore such oaths as were required, retained what of their titles and wealth could be retained under the new arrangements, and found ways to occupy a France that had a different master than the one they had served. The Bourbons, for their part, could not simply execute their way through a list of the most capable military commanders France possessed, and so there was, on both sides, a managed negotiation between what had been done in Napoleon's name and what could be forgiven or overlooked in the interest of stability. Not everyone navigated this. Michel Ney, did not navigate it. When Napoleon escaped from Elba in March of 1815 and returned to France, the episode known as the 100 Days, those compressed final weeks of the empire before Waterloo ended it permanently, Ney had promised the Bourbon king, Louis XVI, that he would stop the returned emperor. He had reportedly said he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. Then he met his old soldiers on the road, and his old soldiers presented their muskets to him butt first in the gesture of surrender and defection, and Ney looked at the men he had commanded for 20 years and made his choice. He joined Napoleon. The 100 Days followed. Waterloo followed. And then the second permanent restoration of the Bourbons followed, and now Ney's promise to the king and his defection to the emperor were both on the record, unambiguously, with witnesses, in a way that accommodation could not easily resolve. He was tried for treason and executed in December of 1815, shot by a firing squad in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. He reportedly refused a blindfold and gave the order to fire himself. He was 56 years old. The cooper's son from Sarre-Louis, who had been Le Brave des Braves, the Prince of the Moskva, the man who commanded the final rearguard of the retreat from Russia and held the collapsing army together by something that amounted to sheer personal force. He died against a wall in a garden in Paris in the winter after the last defeat. His end is the other face of the same coin whose first face shows an innkeeper's son ascending to a throne. Both things were real. Both things were possible within the same system. The career that was open to talent was open in both directions, toward heights of wealth and title that the old world would not have sanctioned, and toward endings that the old world's nobleman, with his legal protections and his ancient name, might have been better equipped to survive. What, then, is the meaning of all of it, held together at once? Begin with the urn. Somewhere in France in the first years of the 19th century, a young man is standing in a town hall. He is 20 or 21 years old, or perhaps he is 17 or 18, and the rules have recently expanded in ways that reached him sooner than he expected. The room is full of his cohort, the other young men of his class, his age, his village, or his neighborhood, and they are waiting for the moment that will divide them. The urn is in front of them, containing the numbered tickets that the lottery calls tirage au sort. Someone reaches in and draws. The numbers come out. High number, you stay. Low number, you march. The man who marched, follow him through everything that the narration has traced. He marched with a pack on his back that weighed as much as a child, carrying a musket that was accurate to 50 meters and misfired one time in 5, eating the ration when the ration arrived and living off the land when it did not, earning a few sous a day in theory and somewhat less in practice, supplementing the whole arrangement with whatever the informal economy of the campaign made available. He might have died in the first winter of dysentery in a field hospital that would not have recognized the connection between its conditions and the deaths it produced. He might have died on a road in Russia in 1812 beside silver he had taken from a burning city, lying down in the snow because the road had taken everything he had to give. He might have died in a dozen other campaigns in a dozen other countries, of a dozen other causes, most of them unglamorous and poorly documented, and unattached to any of the great names or battles that organize the history people know. Or he might have been the other kind. He might have been the man who showed at the right moment that he could be trusted with the company's accounts and was promoted to caporal and then to sergeant, who proved in battle that he could hold a position and was commissioned on the field as a sous-lieutenant, who wore the Legion ribbon with an annual pension of 250 francs and knew that it was not enough and wore it anyway because the honor was real even when the money was not, who rose perhaps to the grade of colonel and sat atop a regimental financial machine that was complicated and occasionally scandalous and entirely central to the welfare of the hundreds of men in his care, who in the best and rarest case continued to rise and became what the summits of this particular army made possible. A man of nothing who became a man of everything, or enough of everything to transform the meaning of his name across generations. The system that produced both outcomes, the frozen man in the snow and the dynasty that still reigns in Sweden, was the same system. That is not a contradiction that resolves tidily if you turn it at the right angle. It is the actual shape of the thing. The mobility was real and the mass death was real, and they were not separate phenomena that existed in separate parts of the story. They were the same phenomenon, viewed from different points in the same structure. The baton in the knapsack was there. The bodies in the snow were also there. They were the two faces of the same coin, and the coin was Napoleon's army, and the coin was spent across those 15 or 20 years on a scale that has no easy parallel in the history that preceded it. It is possible to hold that in mind without it resolving into a verdict. The history does not require a verdict from us. It requires only attention, the specific, patient, material attention that follows the money and the body from the urn to the end of the road, rung by rung, without looking away from what the road actually cost. The cannons are silent now. The urn is still. The dotations were reassigned. The marshals who survived made what peace they could. The grognards aged into the men you see in drawings of the late Restoration, old, decorated, deliberate in their movements, carrying the accumulated weight of decades of campaign in the way that the body carries what it has been made to endure. The Marie-Louises who came home to a France that needed to find some way to absorb the enormous fact of what had happened to it, and they lived out their lives in the ordinary world, working and aging, the ribbon on the coat if they had earned it, the memory in the body regardless. Jean-Roch Coignet, who learned to read in his 30s so that he could hold his commission, who was an illiterate orphan from the countryside and became an officer and a legionnaire and a survivor of campaigns too numerous to count, he sat down in his later years and wrote it all out in the letters he had taught himself, in the words that the army had made it necessary for him to acquire. His memoir is there. The document exists. The man existed, and the ribbon existed, and the road from where he started to where he ended was one that no previous system would have shown him, and he walked it, and he wrote it down because it was worth writing down. And somewhere tonight, very far from all of that, you are lying still in the dark, and the narration has carried you from the urn to the baton and down the far side, and the whole long ladder of it is behind you now, rank by rank, each rung with its own wages and its own weight, and its own specific truth about what the lives inside it actually cost. Let it settle. The road is long and the history is long, and the weight of it can rest now. You have been all the way to the summit and back, and you have seen what the summit looked like from the ground up, and you have seen what the ground looked like from the summit, and the view from both directions is the same history, just lit from different angles. There are more slow journeys here of the same patient and careful kind, waiting for whenever you want them. If you feel moved to leave a word about where you are in the world tonight, what country the dark is over as you listen, the space is there, and it is genuinely read. But for now, you have done enough. The accounts are settled, the ranks are at rest, the blue velvet baton is laid down somewhere in an archive, and the urn is empty, and the road through the whole long ascent from the conscript to the marshal is quiet at last. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.